siamo on. So, good morning, everyone. We are almost ready to start this webinar, but I'm noticing that the number of participants to this webinar is rising, let's say, second by second. So let's give, the right time to other people to connect, and then we can start the webinar. Thank you. Okay, now we are almost 50 participants. It's always my starting target, so I think that we can start. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Elisa Furlan. I'm a scientist at the Foundation Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, and I'm currently engaged into the Division of Risk Assessment and Adaptation Strategies. So, I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar that will be presented by my colleague, Cristina Cipriano. Cristina is a researcher in the Division on Impacts on Agriculture, Forest and Ecosystem Services at CMCC, where she joined last year, so she's brand new in the crew. She's also engaged in the National Biodiversity Center, and with a bachelor degree in biology and a master degree in environmental change and global sustainability, Cristina research focused on investigating the impact of climate change on terrestrial ecosystem using advanced modeling techniques to understand and unraveling the ecological responses and forecast future scenario under climate change, as you can expect. So, what are we going to focus on today? So today she will tell us more about the legislative process underpinning the adoption of the Nature Restoration Law, quite a hot topic, I would say, a law that is rooted into the European Biodiversity Strategies for the 2030. I suppose that most of you joined this webinar, right, to get more knowledge on the process underpinning the adoption of the law, because despite facing opposition and several friction, the law was adopted finally the last June. And let's say it's really an ambitious law. It could be even more ambitious, but it aims to restore 20% of the European land and sea by the 2030, and then progressively rise the target by 2050. But before starting with this amazing story, I can tell you something more about the CMCC for people which don't know CMCC. CMCC is a research center that is based in Italy with the main goal of investigating and model our climate system, and then also the complex interplay occurring with society and environmental system. But why? Basically to provide reliable, rigorous, and timely scientific results while stimulating sustainable growth, environmental protection, biodiversity gains, and climate change adaptation. Right, for this aim, the CMCC is organized in 3 main research institutes which collaborate all together under a very active and multidisciplinary environment, which allow to explore multiple dimensions of climate change, because you can understand that it's really a multifaceted research domain while exploiting the advanced technologies as provided by the CMCC computing infrastructure. In this setting, another peculiarity of the CMCC is the supercomputing center that was made operative in the 2008. So with a hot computing and storage facility that were upgraded, right, 2 years ago in the 2022 to finalize and activate the new supercomputing center that is in our brand new headquarters in Lecce. We have no only office in Lecce, as you can see from this map, but the foundation spread across the whole country, across the whole Italy, and is organized in a network of thematic center groups and division distributed, as you can see, in Viterbo, Sassari, Bologna, Venice. I'm based in Venice, just to let you know. So we are covering, let's say, the whole country with our offices and our research on climate change. Some historical information for moving back into the past of CMCC. It was first established in the form of a consortium company, and then it became a foundation since the 2015, if I'm not wrong. And as you can see, its members are Italian university, research are still member and institutional partner of the CMCC. So you can see that we have the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, but also the Ca' Foscari University of Venice. So it's really a very articulated network of partners who establish CMCC, but then are still member of this network. So how the webinar of today is going to work. So some basic instruction just to be, let's say, operative then into the Q&A session. So your audio and video are deactivated by default. And if you want to jump into the discussion and pose some tricky questions that are the best one to Cristina, you can use the Q&A section, and then it will be, let's say, my responsibility to share with Cristina and keep the discussion, how can I say, with high temperature, as I used to say. So I think that now I can shut up and everything is ready to give the floor to my colleague Cristina, and to all participants to this webinar, please enjoy it. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Elisa, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. So just a second so I can share my screen. Okay. And here we go. Okay, so you should be seeing everything correctly, I hope.
Everything fine. Thank you, Cristina.
Perfect. Okay, so let's start with a very quick summary of the legislative process in the EU, which involves several institutions and steps. So the European Commission proposes a new law or changes to an already existing law, and then there's the European Parliament and Council that consider the proposal, they debate, and they vote on it. So if Parliament and the Council, let's say, is it going forward with the next slide? I hope, yes. So, so if Parliament and Council do not reach an agreement at the first reading, then there's an interinstitutional dialogue that is initiated to find a compromise, obviously. And if necessary, then Parliament and Council can revise the proposal at a second reading. Once they reach an agreement, the proposal is then adopted as a law of the Union. And when adopted, then member states must transpose the European law into their national legal system. So this is just a very, very short recap of what goes on for every single law. So our journey, our particular journey, begins in 2021 with the European Parliament, when the European Parliament approves the European Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. And at the time, Spanish MEP Cesar Luena, who will then become the law's rapporteur, calls for the strategy's goals of restoring, protecting, and conserving nature to be made mandatory with a biodiversity law that also sets deadlines. And it was precisely in that moment that the concept of the nature restoration law was officially born. So the law proposal was presented by the Commission in 2022 with a very ambitious text, actually. And it was born as a proactive proposal and not just a protective one, because the European Commission's vision is not limited to imagining defensive legislative tools, but it expands to the need to restore Europe's degraded habitats, which are well over 80%. So the goal is to restore at least 20% of the EU's land and seas by 2030. And as part of this broader goal, countries must restore 30% of already degraded habitats in their territories by 2030. And then the target increases to at least 60% by 2040 and at least 9% by 2050. And this is valid for all habitats, including urban areas and agroecosystems. And in addition to an overall restoring target, there are also specific objectives that are included for EU ecosystems based on member states' habitats for the dual purpose of facilitating biodiversity restoration on one hand, but also increasing climate change mitigation and adaptation through restoration itself. So after restoration, no degradation of ecosystems should be allowed. This law is additional to what a series of directives have already provided for nature for over 20 years, over 30, sorry, not 20, over 30 years. So for instance, we have the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive, but these have clearly not have been enough to reverse the worrying trend that we have with biodiversity. Of course, unlike directives, a law establishes legally binding targets and obligations for member states, and there will be obviously also criminal consequences for non-compliance. The nature restoration law is the first continent-wide law for nature, demonstrating the EU's leadership in nature protection and restoration, and going on to set standards for global action on biodiversity, as well as fulfilling international commitments that were made in the coming Montreal Agreement during COP15. Just a reminder, COP16 is coming up. So the Commission officially adopted the proposal on June 22nd of 2022. And just a year later, so on June 20th of 2023, the European Council reached an initial agreement on the proposal, and this initial agreement then started negotiations with Parliament on the final version of the regulation. The Council's text somewhat retained the ambitious restoration goals, but it allowed for more flexibility for member states by introducing specific time and application changes from the Commission's proposal. So what happened is that they reduced administrative burdens and they created potential loopholes. And let's say that these accommodations and flexibilities were added especially for the Nordic countries and habitats. In Parliament, the regulation proposal was referred to the Environment Committee, which is currently the largest committee in Parliament. The Committee on Fisheries and the Committee on Agriculture are associated committees to the Environment Committee, and this is set by Rule 57 of the Parliament's Rules of Procedure. So in May 2023, both the Agri and Tech committees rejected the Commission's proposal, arguing that it was too demanding and it didn't really clarify who would be paying for all these restoration measures. So what happened is that then the ENVI committee also had to vote, and they voted on amendments to the proposed text on June 15 and June 27 of 2023. But the final vote ended up in a tie, meaning that there was no majority in the committee to support the nature restoration law as amended. So as a result, what happened was that ENVI was forced, had no other choice, was forced to present to plenary a proposal to reject the Commission's text. And it's almost a paradox, actually, but the tie somehow saved the law because it was the very, very bare minimum for it to continue towards a vote in Parliament, where it would still have to fight for survival again. But why did the law come so close to failure exactly? What prompted the vote against it? So to understand this, we really need to give a better look at how the current European Parliament is structured. And this is the Parliament that was elected in 2019, so not the one we just elected for. So the European People's Party strongly argued that the law would harm food security and punish producers economically. And they were referring to farmers, fishermen, and businesses. And because EPP is the center-right party, but also the largest party in parliament, their claims shifted the balance in opinions. But outside parliament, the situation was very different, and citizens did not hesitate to respond. So these claims were rejected in an open letter that was signed by over 6,000 scientists, which was then also supported by plenty of businesses, around 200 non-governmental organizations, and well over 1 million people. So the opposition's claims were not based on scientific evidence, but these claims also contradicted what science actually says, because indeed the law allows for economic activities to take place, it respects property rights, and it ensures long-term food security with restoration benefits of 1.86 trillion euros by 2050, against a much lower estimated cost of 154 billion, which would be the cost to actually implement all these restoration activities. So climate mitigation benefits alone outweigh these costs, because it has been estimated also that for every euro invested in ecological restoration, there are up to 38 euros in return. But let's go back to Parliament. So what happens here is that on July 12th of 2023, Parliament took a vote, barely rejecting the rejection proposal. So by rejecting the rejection proposal, they could finally vote for the adoption of the nature restoration law, and they did adopt it, but they adopted it with a very, very slim majority. So what happened is that in the weeks leading up to the vote, the European People's Party, it's always them, had continued to oppose the law by spreading disinformation along with other right-wing parties. But this was not enough, luckily, to get it rejected. And some conservative MEPs broke with their party line by voting in favor of an amended version of the law. So keep in mind, an amended version. And it's precisely the text approved by Parliament that represents the massive sore spot in the adoption, because it includes several amendments that significantly change the substance of the Commission's initial proposal. And what happened is that the Parliament accepted many elements of the position adopted by the Council on June 20th of 2023. And this position includes various flexibilities and derogations that weaken the text. So Parliament mandates restoration measures only for Natura 2000 sites without the specific quantitative time-bound targets. And they also removed agroecosystem restoration targets entirely, while also allowing for postponement of targets due to severe socio-economic impacts. This was a compromise. And Parliament then removes the obligation, and I stress the word obligation, to prevent ecosystem deterioration. And they also removed the article on access to environmental justice, which would have allowed civil society to sue member states over national restoration plans. Additionally, the text emphasizes pollinator diversity improvements by 2030, supports the planting of 3 billion trees by 2030, aligns marine ecosystem restoration with fisheries policy, and requires the Commission to assess funding gaps for restoration efforts within 1 year. So keep in mind that all these points highlighted in blue all passed into the final law. But what about the first two, right? The first two are the ones that are kind of most concerning here. There were some changes. So in November 2023, luckily, a deal was reached, and it was approved to restore at least 20% of the EU's land and sea by 2030, and all ecosystems, so including agroecosystems, that need restoration by 2050. while still maintaining, luckily, time-bound targets. So just like intended by the original proposal by the European Commission. But this time, there were flexibilities that were added. So the agreement includes priority restoration for Natura 2000 sites just up until 2030. And then there are also extensions for renewable energy projects and in case of national defense. There are also various flexibilities in the ecosystem-specific obligations, including many flexibilities for rewetting peatlands, which is a whole different story. And then there is an emergency brake that we saw in the previous slide that could actually allow the suspension of agroecosystem restoration up to 1 year if food production is threatened in any possible way. It's an emergency procedure, obviously. So emergency means it shouldn't be used, technically. So in February 2024, Parliament formally adopted this agreement in plenary. So this is what we're dealing with. The regulation proposal right now, after the vote in Parliament, was basically very close to sealing the deal. But what happened is that on March 22nd, earlier this year, EU member states failed to reach the majority needed to adopt the law. What happened is that Hungary did a U-turn, joining opposing votes from Sweden, the Netherlands, Poland, and Italy, and the abstentions from Finland, Belgium, and Austria. So Hungary was previously in favor of the nature restoration law. This rejection came at a time when farmers across the EU were protesting rising costs, reduced incomes, and all the burdens associated with overregulation. This turnaround at this precise stage of the law's journey has somewhat compromised the public image of European institutions because the regulation had gone through the Commission, the Council, Parliament, and trilogues, and it came such a long way, and it had arrived towards the end of its legislative process. Therefore, reversing direction at this point, after all those negotiations, was quite strange. And it was strange, but it was a move that was considered political ahead of the European elections. So at this point, there wouldn't have been enough time for a new council vote before the change of presidency, which happened just now in July. This is because the presidency of the European Council is held in turn by member states every 6 months. And up until a few weeks ago, it was held by Belgium, whereas since July 1st, it is now held by Hungary. But we have seen that Hungary is against the law. And it certainly would not have been Hungary's priority to call for a new council vote. So the problem would have been that if they hadn't reached an agreement, there would have had to be a second reading of the law, and it would have had to go back to Parliament, which is a new Parliament, the one we just voted for, and in which most MEPs are not really in favor of the law. So the nature restoration law was basically considered essentially dead. It had already come so far by barely surviving. But you know the saying, right? Where there is a will, there is a way. So premised on the fact that the EU Council brings together the relevant ministers for each member state, in this case, the ministers for the environment, the person who had the will and found the way was the rotating president of the EU Council, which was still Belgium at the time. He was the one who chose to put the nature restoration law vote back on the agenda, going against the direction of the Belgian Prime Minister. And June 17 marked a historical moment in environmental history as the European Council officially adopted the nature restoration law thanks to Austria's decisive vote, which came to everyone's surprise. So the surprise lies in the fact that Austria was expected to abstain along with Belgium, because of internal disagreements within their respective countries. We already knew who the opposing countries were, and that includes Italy, and it was also joined by Finland, which had previously abstained and then decided to vote against the law. So with these votes, the law would not have made it again. But Austria's environment minister stood up to her government's directives, and she casted the deciding vote to finally pass and save the long-awaited law. So Leonor Gelesla is a Green Party minister who knew full well what she was doing at the time of the vote. The Austrian opposition did not approve of its minister's rebellious act and filed 2 complaints with the European Court of Justice, seeking the annulment of the vote, and another complaint against the minister herself for abuse of power. But she claims to have acted legitimately since she consulted with legal experts. And the reason why her vote is legitimate is because on environmental issues, Austrian law requires that all federated states agree. And if there is no consensus, then the federal minister can decide on its own. And what happened is precisely this. Indeed, shortly before the vote, what happened is that the state of Vienna changed its mind, changed its position, and since there was no longer unanimity against the law, this allowed the minister to vote independently. So the European Council then validated this vote in a decision that was deliberately quick to prevent Hungary from opposing the law again, since Hungary would have taken over the presidency of the Council in July and had already opposed the law. So now we finally have this law, but what does it look like? So the law is organized into 28 articles, divided into 6 chapters and 7 annexes. Restoration targets and timelines to be met are all specified within Chapter 2, and the possibility for member states to prioritize until 2030 areas located in Natura 2000 sites is specified in Article 4. And also in Article 4, the law provides for the restoration of terrestrial, coastal, and freshwater ecosystems. Then we have Article 5 that is on marine ecosystems, Article 8 on urban ecosystems, Article 9 on rivers and floodplains, 10 on pollinators, 11 agroecosystems, the article that we were all worried about, then Article 12 on forests, and then there's Article 13 that provides a commitment for member states to plant at least 3 billion new trees by 2030 at the union level. And then there are both Chapter 3 and 4 that provide how and when member states are to prepare and evaluate national implementation plans, including monitoring and reporting. And then there's just other legal jargon that I won't bore you with right now. So the law targets a large-scale improvement of habitats, as we have seen, and species populations as well across various ecosystems with specific targets for each ecosystem. For example, we see in agroecosystems that targets focus on enhancing biodiversity and carbon sequestration while restoring drained peatlands. I'll just leave these targets here for future reference, but we can go on. There are 7 annexes. The first 2 define terrestrial and marine habitats with reference to Articles 4 and 5. Then there's the third that is a list of marine species, so the main marine species that we are considering in the law. Then there is Annex 4, 5, and 6, where we see that there is a series of indicators that are defined. These indicators are mainly for agriculture and forest environments, and they're ranging from farmland and forest birds to the presence of standing and lying deadwood, forest connectivity, and so on. So these all refer to Articles 11 and Article 12. Finally, there's Annex 7, which is just a list that includes several examples of restoration measures. Then you can look at them into more detail if you want on your own. So from the moment the law is published in the European Official Journal, it enters into force after 20 days. So right now, member states will have to work on implementation plans so that the law lives on in their respective territories. EU countries will need to submit national restoration plans to the Commission within 2 years, so by mid-2026, showing how they plan to deliver on these targets with requirements for monitoring and reporting on their progress towards these goals. Member states will choose where to restore, what to restore, and how to restore. And together, all the national restoration plans coming from all member states need to adapt to the targets. The European Environment Agency will draw up the regular technical reports on progress towards the targets, and then the European Commission will evaluate the impact of the law in 2033, with a focus on sectors such as agriculture, fisheries, and forestry to make any possible corrections to the law. The Commission will also report to Parliament and to the Council on the implementation of the law. And we know that there is a lot of work to be done, and we are under very, very tight deadlines because 2030 is just around the corner, and restoration targets will then be increasingly ambitious as 2040 and 2050 respectively approach. But let's also address the massive elephant in the room, shall we? A major issue identified early on is the lack of a sanctioning mechanism. So member states can bring forward national restoration plans, but there is no clear course of action if they fail to implement restoration plans effectively. The focus has been primarily on setting targets, and they lost track of implementation aspects, such as better guidelines for monitoring and reporting frequency. Another area for improvement is structuring the dialogue between the Commission and member states more efficiently. Because if member states are falling short of their restoration objectives, we need timely detection and a defined compliance mechanism to address this. These considerations will probably be evaluated for improving the regulation in 2033. A significant challenge, though, will be convincing member states who were opposed to the law, including Italy, to actively work on these plans, especially since the law lacks real sanctioning mechanisms. And at the same time, the law is also demanding substantial commitments from member states. So some form of pressure will need to be exerted on national and regional governments because member states often view nature restoration as a lower priority compared to other financial obligations, despite the many economic benefits that restoration offers. So indeed, the benefits of implementing this law are potentially enormous, from halting biodiversity loss and reversing the trend to a natural response to the climate crisis and so much more. And all of this is placed in a short, medium, and long-term perspective that is an absolute first for European environmental policy. No measure to date has had this kind of foresight and at the same time this concreteness, providing for an active restoration in interventions across the continent. So the birds and habitats directives are protection tools, as we said earlier, whereas the nature restoration law is an action tool. And together, they represent a real possibility for European biodiversity. It is a huge opportunity that must be seized, especially for researchers. It is true that the law's text is highly flexible and full of potential loopholes, but knowing these loopholes is not only useful for those who want to circumvent the law, but it is also useful for those who want to enforce it. So nature is calling right now, and we are all on the front lines. Plenty of opportunities will surely be opening up to be supportive of all these restoration plans, as well as new research prospects for European projects. And it's our responsibility to make the best of them. Here you can find some references for everything that I've been saying so far. And I just wanted to thank you for your attention.
So, Cristina, thank you so much. Thank you for this, let's say, presentation and for, let's say, highlighting this prominent topic that I will say, let me to be a little bit honest, it's a kind of drama. I mean, the process has been quite long with, let's say, a lot of stories behind, but especially I was interested, I mean, the law find, let's say, some obstacle and some friction, especially emerged during the process, especially linked to the agriculture and fishery sector. But can you explain me why, especially from these two sectors, we find all this friction?
Well, it wasn't just those sectors, actually, because if we really want to be honest here, there were many different frictions throughout the whole process. And these frictions emerged from negotiating different institutions, which had clear different visions. So for the council, the primary concern was the non-deterioration principle, along with issues related to urban areas, particularly voiced by Nordic countries who did a lot of lobbying and actively pushed for compromises. So the first flexibilities were added specifically for these aspects and habitats. But then on the other hand, there was Parliament, and for Parliament, the main issue was the article on agriculture, as you were saying. But the debate over this law, and I cannot stress this enough, has been strongly biased and hampered by disinformation. So the main argument that was led by the EPP group was that the law could cause a decrease in food production and an increase in prices, leading to food insecurity. And again, as I was saying earlier, the Commission, over 6,000 scientists, many NGOs, and so on, activists as well, have demonstrated through scientific evidence and scientific studies that the opposite is actually true, right? The law will improve food security and enhance European food systems, as the main threats for European food security are climate change and biodiversity loss, which are the two things that this law wants to help address, right? So the European conservatives and reformists, which is the ECR group, were implementing an election strategy by linking their opposition to the law to farmer protests that were happening at that time across the continent. And this is not a sign of goodwill towards farmers, because the far right, sometimes with the help of conservatives, which has been the case for this law, have been on a journey to weaken, delay, or even kill every remaining aspect of the Green Deal. So the conflicts over this law were just part of the process of eroding the Green Deal, right? So the ECR's attempt to stop the legislative procedure is actually quite typical for this Eurosceptic group. And let's say EPP's concerns about the law and about food security were all fully addressed during trilogue negotiations between Parliament, the Commission, and the Council. Then there's also another unusual aspect here to this law, of this whole legislative process. It is that the Council had a better position than Parliament. And this is a reversal of the typical dynamic that happens in European institutions. This had actually never happened before. This was the very first time that this happened, because normally it is Parliament that represents the source of, let's say, innovative ideas. However, in this case, Parliament was derailed by a fake news campaign, while the Council maintained a more sensible approach and focused on the main principles of the law, which made sense. And then something else I'd like to point out here is that this law has been supported also by central banks, which can be, let's say, quite strange, right? It can seem quite strange. But what's happening right now is that central banks are realizing that the majority of the EU economy is highly dependent on the state of nature. You can find figures that are showing how 72% of all EU companies, and if I'm not mistaken, 75% of all loans to EU companies are highly dependent on at least one ecosystem service between water, air quality, stability of land, and so on. So it's quite interesting that this law had many unusual alliances. Even the businesses that everybody was so afraid that would be harmed, the businesses were actually supporting the law. For example, it started with the hydroelectric sector supporting it, which is curious because if you think about it, all this river restoration goes with removing dams, and yet the hydroelectric sector was supporting it. And at the same time, companies like Coca-Cola, H&M, and so many other big controversial companies you would not expect would be in favor of the law were still supporting it. And all this support by businesses was actually making it even more difficult and more complicated for EPP members to even contrast the law in the first place. So their disinformation campaign was kind of turning against themselves because there was massive approval from the society in all sectors. So I just wanted to make this clear.
Yeah, thank you, Cristina. I'm trying to go through the Q&A, let's say the questions that are arising on the chat, and maybe I can go through. First question is, do we anticipate any impact of this natural law on the financial sector?
Well, yes, there will be an impact, but the impact will be positive because, as I was saying, even businesses realize that this law is good for them because having habitats and nature in a good state actually benefits everything that businesses do because businesses are highly reliant on the well-being of nature. So yes, it will have an economic impact. And if you're even wondering right now, if we always want to maintain, let's say, the focus on money, another thing that I haven't really mentioned right now is how will all these restoration measures be financed, right? So yes, it's important to have, obviously, there will be an impact on, let's say, companies and industries and so on, but how are we going to finance these restoration measures? At the moment, we don't know yet. As we've seen, the Commission will have to come up with something within 1 year from the law entering into force, which it has. And so then in a year, we will have a better understanding of all the funding possibilities in view of the next multi-annual financial framework. But what we do know right now instead is that the agreed text clarifies that national restoration plans do not require countries to reprogram the common agricultural policy, which was also another concern, or the common fisheries policies. And these fundings were set up to 2027 by the MFF. So nothing will be touched from that kind of funding. We're just going to have to find out where the funding is going to be coming from. Right now, the absence of a clear funding mechanism is something that was pointed out by critics of the final regulation as well. And let's say, besides the funding problem, once these restoration efforts will take place, again, it will just benefit people. And this is something that is very important, I think, to pass through, because it has been presented as something that wants to attack farmers or people because, oh, with all this nature restoration, there won't be enough land for economic activities. But that is absolutely not true. There can be a good coexistence of economic activities and nature. So this is not a law against farmers at all. It is not a law against people. This is probably one of the most important things that we need to get across. We need to balance all interests and ensure the involvement of all stakeholders and right holders within the implementation, which is going to be an important aspect.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that this is a message that needs to be shared, that it's not a law that is against some economic activity, some sector, but it has to be seen also with a very big opportunity for also new job creation. There is another question that is very interesting here in the chat about the new European soil strategy and how the European restoration law connects and creates a synergy and is coherent with the soil strategy.
So basically, it's all up to us to then see with the specific sectors what we want to be doing with this law, because obviously the targets of this law are huge. Let's say they go across all kinds of ecosystems, and obviously all ecosystems also include soil protection. So everything that researchers can do from now on, I'm responding now here to the soil strategy, but it is something that can be, let's say, extended in general, not just to soil. It's that there will be plenty of research opportunities right now that will be opening up. So do consider that once we will have a better understanding of what kind of financial aid will be taken, will be considered, let's say, there will be research opportunities also for people who study soil, also for soil protection, but not only. It is up to us to understand what, let's say, we can anticipate in some way, the kind of support that this law will need in order to actually meet the law's multiple targets. And we need to use this knowledge to our advantage. So yes, absolutely, there will be links with the law in terms of how the soil will be treated and so on, because a big part, a massive part, actually, biodiversity is within our soils. There is tons of biodiversity in our soils, and they are often, let's say, disregarded. So the law is still very, very, let's say, vague at the moment. It is vague enough to, let's say, be able to apply it to different conditions. But at the same time, again, it is, let's say, up to us to identify what the key things, key aspects would be in order to meet these targets. For sure, soils will play an important role. And we will now see, like, I mean, technically right now, to get a better understanding in practical terms, right? In practical terms, what happens, member states have to, let's say, wait for the national restoration plans to be elaborated, to be revised, and then to be validated by the Commission before they can actually start implementing the restoration measures. But in reality, though, if we really go look at this in further detail, given the extremely tightly deadlines, because as we have seen, 2030 is basically tomorrow, member states have to start right now, and that is very clear. Because it's not just something that the law is telling us to do. It's not just something that, let's say, is said by the nature restoration law right now. It is also a commitment that was made by member states in the global biodiversity framework, with targets that were agreed upon much earlier at the international level, so not just at the continental level. So member states need to start acting now in order to really meet the law's goals, but also to meet the international agreements that were discussed in the previous COP. So the scientific community is going to play a very, very important role here, and it will be of the utmost importance to support the whole process, along not only with the scientific community, but also plenty of other stakeholders and rights holders. So I just want to make this clear. I tried using the soil aspect to expand a little bit more, because it's not just an intertwining with a very specific topic. This law is very broad. We are talking about ecosystems on not just soil and terrestrial, but marine and so much more. So I wanted to make this clear. This is not a niche argument. This is going to change. It has the potential to change a lot, because nothing has ever been so big as this law in terms of environmental policy.
I mean, the law posed some requirements. So there is this ambitious target, 20% for tomorrow, basically, as you say, and then rising the target for 2050. There is a question in the chat. So will national government bear the ultimate legal responsibility? So, and thus potentially need to introduce new legislation to pass along this requirement? because we have seen some, let's say, laws directly before. I'm thinking about, for instance, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive imposing the goal of achieving the good environmental status. So then there was, let's say, national laws setting the specific goals and try to get stock taking the information for setting the scene and then figuring out this goal in the good environmental status. So how do you think that the European country will, let's say, go through the implementation and adoption of this law?
Yeah, thank you for this question. This is a very interesting question, actually. There is a lot that single countries can do right now. So let's say what we can expect right now. The first step is to develop these national implementation plans, right? So these national implementation plans need to be developed by mid-2026. This is like really coming up close. So I don't think there's going to be all this time for a whole legislative process on a national level. Obviously, it will depend on each country, on each parliament within the countries. But let me be clear, this is a law. It is not a directive. A directive, it's, let's say, more permissive, kind of, but a law should be legally binding, meaning that we right now have very little time to be thinking big in terms of passing other laws right now and so on. So it is a big challenge. Nobody is denying that it's a massive challenge, actually, because I think what is very important right now is to foster a very, very good communication approach and a very continuous cooperation between all member states. Because what happens, right, like, yes, funding will also be an aspect, but what happens is that member states now need to define which are the best practices, right? They have to define what best practices are in order to meet these targets. And the important aspect is that these best practices need to be communicated from one member state to the other. And this is important because usually what happens is that it takes years and years and years to make implementations of a law really efficient. But right now, we don't have the time to really take all those years and years, because usually it's like 2 years to define certain things and another 2 years to define another thing. We end up getting to 2029 and still trying to figure out how to implement these things. So what actually matters right now, and that the strategy should be to really communicate well among member states in order to make these implementations efficient, faster, much faster than what it would usually take. So yes, absolutely. One aspect I think would be that, but there are actually many obstacles to the implementation process. Besides the creation of, let's say, specific laws for each country, it really depends on the member states here, what they're up to do, because it's all in their hands. What will need to be done, for instance, like 3 months after the law enters into force, so by the end of this year, we need to have the precise template of what all member states need to provide to the Commission. So by the end of the year, we'll have a better idea of what the Commission wants. And this will then be taken into account, obviously, for the national restoration plans. And yes, it will be absolutely hard. It's not, it won't be an easy process. It won't be an easy process, first of all, because the deadlines are extremely tight, because the law targets many ecosystems, and there really has to be a will from countries to do this. But again, it is a law, and I think that a big role will be played also by civil society. Again, as I was saying earlier, some kind of pressure needs to be done on member states, on single member states, because a thing that we have seen earlier was the fact that the massive elephant in the room is that we don't really have a clear sanctioning mechanism. So technically, member states could easily not do things that they're supposed to be doing, even though it's a law. So even though it's a law, the problem is that this law is very tailored made, whereas a law should be more binding and providing more detailed information along with its deadlines and targets. So this is one, let's say, problem for the implementation. So technically, we have this law. we can use this law to our advantage as civil society, as researchers, and so on, for funding for new European projects or whatever. So it is something that we can use as an instrument, but at the same time, we need to remind that this law is technically a law. It's not a directive. It's technically legally binding. And even though we don't have a clear idea of what the sanctioning mechanism is right now, we can expect to be one with, let's say, the law's revision, because this law is not set into stone just as it is right now. There can still be amendments to the law. So that will go enforce even more these aspects. And we need to keep in mind that targets for 2040 and targets for 2050 are even more ambitious. So if we start falling behind now for the targets for 2030, that's going to be even worse than to reach the targets for 2050. So we really need to act synchronously, fast, all possible stakeholders together. There needs to be a lot of cooperation and communication. These are the two things that I think we really need to stress upon, and we need to put pressure. So the more pressure is put on member states, the more member states will technically feel like they have to do something about it because everybody's watching. So this is something I really want to stress upon.
Yeah, completely agree. Orchestrated effort toward the, let's say, the goal posed by this law. If I'm not wrong and following the process, I mean, there was an article on the access to environmental justice that in a certain point was removed. So look, it was removed. Why?
Yeah, so this is still a sore spot here. So yeah, as you were saying, this article was removed from the final version of the law, and it is actually the only article to have been entirely deleted. The reasoning behind this decision was based on the Council's general approach, and there were also procedural constraints. So what happens is that the Parliament's president can return the law to the committee, so it can go back if too many amendments are proposed. So if you make the law go forward with too many amendments, then at some point it's like, okay, it needs to be revised too much. The law needs to go back. So people wanted to obviously avoid this. So in order to avoid that the law would arrive to Parliament with too many amendments, a decision was made to minimize the number of amendments, and there were still many amendments. So this decision, it was actually led by the Renew Group, and it was a political choice made in July, and it was deemed to be the only viable solution at that time. The Commission also expressed deep regret over the removal of this article during the last trilogue negotiation, and the Commission noted the importance of this article. Ultimately, then there was also the release of a symbolic statement that was made emphasizing the article's significance. But let's keep in mind that there will be the revision to the law in 2033, and it is very, very likely that this article will be reconsidered during the next review of the law. So right now, we don't have access to environmental justice, unfortunately, but standing to court might be something that will be included with the next reading, because there is the will from the Commission to put that aspect, put that article back in. So the Commission will very likely propose an amendment to the law. So let's keep, let's say, a closer look on that.
Yeah, thank you, Cristina. Maybe I can go through the last question because we still have 2 minutes. There are people wondering if and what kind of influence the natural restoration law will have at the international level, especially taking into account the context of the next conference of parties. So how do you feel that, let's say, will influence?
Yes, I think this is very, very important, this aspect. Right now, the European Union, like what has been done is a first worldwide. Nobody has ever had a law this big, this massive on a continental scale. So what happens right now is that the EU is setting a standard. It's showing that we are leaders right now in how this process should happen. So we will be going to the COP, let's say, happy and strong that we have this law. At the same time, we have a very weakened law. So this can be a lesson for everyone internationally, because the whole legislative process of this law here in Europe has shown to what extent disinformation campaign can really erode a process. And at the same time, it has also shown the importance of communicating well with the public of what is being proposed. Because as I was stressing earlier, it needs to come through that this is a law for people, not against people. It's not just nature, like it is called nature restoration law, but this law impacts everything. It impacts the economic sector, it impacts people, it's just massive, and it also impacts climate change. It needs to be framed in a global prospect, let's say, in terms of consequences. And yes, the Europe will be showing up at COP with something very strong, let's say, because this law is a first at an international level, and it is also a step towards meeting those goals that were discussed upon in the last COP, in COP 15, as I was mentioning earlier. So this is an international commitment that has been made by all member states, and the ones that are following, let's say, the ones that are more in compliance with what those commitments were, is actually Europe right now, because we are going to present ourselves to the next COP by saying, hey, we have a law. What have you guys done in the meantime? So I think that's something really important, and it demonstrates leadership in this sector. So it will be setting a standard.
Yeah, you're perfectly right. Thank you. I think that we are going to the end of the webinar. So at the first, I really thank you, Cristina, because you highlighted, let's say, all the drama behind the process underpinning the adoption of the law. And you know, I love drama. I really thank you all participants who took part to this webinar. And just to conclude, stay tuned with the CMCC communication channel and see you next time for the next webinar. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.